In 1897, in a quiet English village, the townsfolk gathered to celebrate a wedding that would soon become one of the darkest scandals in recorded history. The groom, a respected widower named Edward Harrow, stood beside a delicate young woman, her face hidden behind a lace veil. They smiled as the vicar pronounced them husband and wife, but what no one in that candlelit chapel knew was that the bride's birth certificate bore the same surname as his, because she was his own daughter. The truth, when it surfaced, tore through the community like a plague and left behind a legacy of shame, deceit, and madness. Edward Harrow was born into privilege, yet marked by tragedy long before his story became infamous. His family owned the sprawling Harrow estate, an ivy-wrapped mansion that stood at the edge of the East Anglian fens, isolated, windswept, and forever damp with fog. He was educated in Cambridge, known for his charm and eloquence, a man who could quote Milton by heart and debate scripture with conviction. But beneath that polished exterior lingered something restless, an obsession with control, with order, with preserving the name and purity of his lineage. Those who knew him in youth spoke of a man who rarely smiled unless speaking of his family's past, as though he carried not memories but a burden disguised as pride. When Edward married Margaret Lane, a woman of grace and warmth, it was seen as the perfect union between intellect and virtue. Their life together began quietly, and for a brief period the Harrow estate seemed alive again. Its windows lit at night, its gardens tended, its halls filled with laughter. Yet that happiness was fleeting. Margaret's health began to fail soon after the birth of their daughter, a child said to be frail but remarkably beautiful. Then came the disappearance. On a winter morning, Margaret was gone. The servants found her bonnet near the riverbank, and the local constable concluded she'd thrown herself into the freezing waters, a conclusion made convenient by her melancholic disposition after childbirth. Edward buried an empty coffin. Days later, he announced that the infant too had succumbed to illness. Grief became his companion, but not in the ordinary sense. He withdrew from society, shuttered the estate, dismissed most of his staff, and spent endless nights in his study, surrounded by dusty genealogies and volumes on inheritance law, writing long letters to no one. Visitors who dared to call on him described the faint sound of piano music at odd hours, and sometimes the echo of a lullaby. One maid, who stayed only a month, claimed she saw him standing in the nursery at midnight whispering to the empty crib. He spoke, she said, as if the child could hear him. By 1890, Edward had become a ghost in the village, a figure both pitied and feared. He appeared at church only on anniversaries, always in black, his gloves immaculate, his gaze unflinching. Rumors grew that he had taken an interest in spiritual matters, dabbling in seances and automatic writing, searching for communion with the dead. Local clergy dismissed such talk as gossip, yet even they avoided his estate after dusk. But through all his eccentricities, Edward maintained a peculiar respectability. His wealth protected him, his eloquence disarmed suspicion. He was the model of a grieving husband, a man whose sorrow, though excessive, was considered tragic rather than dangerous. No one questioned what became of the child's birth records, or why he refused to open the family vault where the empty coffin lay. To the world, Edward Harrow was a widower consumed by loss. Only later would history reveal what his grief had truly hidden. The disappearance of Margaret Harrow and the fate of her infant daughter became one of those stories the villagers spoke of only in hushed tones, half tragedy, half curse. On a bleak January morning in 1878, the maid entered the master bedroom to find the sheets cold and the window ajar, snow drifting onto the carpet. Margaret's dressing gown was gone, and her slippers left at the threshold as if she'd stepped out in haste. The baby's cradle stood empty except for a folded blanket, damp from tears or river mist, no one could tell which. Edward was found hours later by the riverbank, his coat soaked through, staring into the black current that moved like liquid glass. He said nothing for a long time, and when he finally spoke, his words were slow and deliberate. "They are both gone." The constable's report was brief. He concluded that Margaret, in the grip of postpartum melancholy, had taken her own life and the child's. No bodies were ever recovered. The fens were wide and deep, filled with shifting silt that swallowed what it claimed. Edward signed the official statement without protest. He even arranged a funeral, though no one saw the bodies lowered into the family vault. He insisted on a closed casket, and dismissed the undertaker immediately after the ceremony. Some said he lingered in the crypt for hours afterward, alone with the coffins whispering to them. In the weeks that followed, Edward's demeanor changed. He ordered the nursery sealed, the child's belongings burned, and the servants forbidden to speak of the incident. He replaced the staff entirely within months, hiring outsiders who knew nothing of the tragedy. When the villagers inquired about the child, he would only reply that she has found peace. Yet one peculiar detail unsettled those who had worked in the house. Before, the household accounts listed recurring payments to a convent school in Yorkshire, an institution that educated orphaned or endangered girls. The entries appeared only under initials and no one could explain them. Years later, a former servant recalled a day in late spring when she discovered a faint trail of muddy footprints leading from the river to the side gate of the estate, small, like those of a child. She mentioned it to Edward, who went pale and ordered her never to speak of it again. Within a week, she was dismissed without wages. The matter was quietly forgotten, written off as superstition, but some villagers remained uneasy. Fishermen claimed that on foggy nights a woman's figure could be seen drifting along the banks, clutching a bundle to her chest. Dogs howled without reason near the water's edge. Children were warned not to wander too close. Edward, meanwhile, immersed himself in his studies of law and ancestry, his obsession with purity of lineage growing more severe with each passing year. He wrote to the bishop about legal inheritance rights, asking if blood unbroken held divine significance, a question that baffled the clergyman. By the time the new decade began, the story of Margaret's disappearance had faded into local legend. No one imagined that the baby might have lived. No one guessed that somewhere, perhaps in that convent up north, a young girl was growing up with no memory of her past, carrying within her the forgotten name of Harrow. When Clara Whitmore arrived in East Anglia in the spring of 1896, few could have imagined how her presence would unearth the long-buried sins of the Harrow estate. She came by carriage from the north, carrying only a small trunk and a letter of recommendation from a convent school in Yorkshire. Her manner was modest, her voice soft, her eyes a curious gray that seemed to shift with the light. The villagers regarded her kindly at first, another governess seeking respectable employment in a region where old families still clung to fading titles. But even on her first Sunday at St. Bartholomew's, whispers began. Some said her face was familiar, as though they had seen her once as a child. Others noticed the scar beneath her collarbone, a pale mark shaped like a crescent moon. Few remembered that Edward Harrow's infant daughter had borne a scar in the very same place. Clara quickly found work with the neighboring Whitcomb family, teaching their two young daughters and keeping mostly to herself. She spent her afternoons walking through the fens, sketching the landscape or reading beneath the twisted willows. One afternoon, she crossed paths with Edward Harrow. By then, he was a shadow of the man he had been, his once dark hair streaked with silver, his face drawn and severe. He greeted her politely, yet with a strange intensity that made her lower her gaze. In the weeks that followed, their paths crossed again and again, at the church, in the market, by the narrow bridge near the old mill. To onlookers, it appeared a harmless acquaintance, a grieving widower speaking kindly to a young woman new to the parish. But those who saw them up close spoke of something unsettling in his expression, an almost paternal tenderness that flickered into something darker. By summer, Clara began visiting the Harrow estate under the pretense of helping Edward organize his library. She seemed drawn to the place, to its silence and decay, as if something within its walls called to her. The servants noticed how she lingered in the upper corridors, pausing before locked doors, tracing her fingers over the dust-covered portraits of women long dead. In the nursery, sealed since the tragedy years before, she once pressed her ear to the wooden door and whispered, "It feels familiar." When asked about it later, she smiled faintly and said she had dreamt of the room before ever setting foot in it. Edward's demeanor toward her grew increasingly possessive. He insisted she dine with him, that she abandon her employment with the Whitcombs and take residence at his estate, for convenience. The villagers whispered, but no one intervened. In the evenings, passers-by claimed to see the two of them walking the grounds by lamplight, their shadows merging as if they were one. To Clara, he spoke of destiny, of lost souls bound by fate. To Edward, she was more than a woman. She was a symbol of restoration, a living echo of something he had lost long ago. And though neither yet spoke of it aloud, both felt the same strange pull, a recognition too deep to name and far too dangerous to deny. It was not until years later, when the Harrow estate had fallen into ruin and its secrets lay scattered among the dust of forgotten rooms, that the truth about Edward and Clara came to light through a series of hidden journals. Discovered by a clerk sent to catalog the property after Edward's death, the journals were bound in black leather and written in the same meticulous hand that had once recorded the family's lineage. Their contents were unlike anything scholars or priests had ever read, pages filled with yearning, guilt, and the steady unraveling of a man's mind. Within them, Edward chronicled every detail of his growing obsession with Clara Whitmore, though the earliest entries were written years before she arrived. "I dream of her still," he wrote in one passage dated 1887, "the child who should have died but does not leave my thoughts. I hear her crying in the river, and when I look into the current, I see not a child but a woman, calling me home." As the entries continued, the tone shifted from grief to a strange sort of devotion. Edward convinced himself that his daughter's spirit had survived in another form, that the divine had granted him a second chance to complete what was once broken. By the time Clara appeared in the village, he interpreted her arrival as a sign from God, an incarnation of his lost child returned to redeem him. He wrote of recognizing her eyes, her laugh, her handwriting that mirrored Margaret's, and the faint scar he had once kissed on an infant's skin. Yet he did not speak of these things to Clara. Instead, he recorded his torment in the pages of his journal, torn between paternal love and an affection that defied all morality. "I have long ceased to know whether my affection is fatherly or divine," he confessed. "The blood that binds us feels not a boundary, but a circle without end." Clara's own writings, found in a small leather notebook hidden beneath a loose floorboard in her room, revealed a parallel descent. At first she referred to Edward with reverence, a guardian of intellect and sorrow. But as time passed, her tone grew uncertain. She described dreams of a river and a crying infant, and once an image of herself as a child reaching for a man's hand. "When he looks at me," she wrote, "it is as though he remembers something I have forgotten." She noted the moments he would flinch at the sound of her laughter, the way his hands trembled when fastening the clasp of her necklace. Still, she felt bound to him, unable to explain the connection that drew her to the man everyone else called distant, even cold. Together, their writings formed a confession without a voice, a dialogue between a father who refused to accept the boundaries of nature and a daughter who recognized too late what their bond truly meant. The final entries in Edward's journal coincided with the weeks before their marriage, his handwriting erratic, the words blurring between ecstasy and madness. "I am closer to her now than to God," he wrote, "and if that is sin, then let heaven weep, for I shall not repent." The night the village doctor uncovered the truth began with a desperate summons. It was late December 1896, when a boy from the Harrow estate arrived at Dr. Alistair Fenwick's door, breathless and pale, saying that Mrs. Harrow was ill, and that Mr. Harrow demanded immediate discretion. The storm outside was relentless, wind shrieking through the chimney flues as Fenwick gathered his bag and lantern. The path to the estate was nearly impassable, the fen road drowned in fog and sleet. By the time he reached the gates, the light from the house flickered faintly through the mist. One room illuminated, the rest in darkness. Inside, the air was thick with candle smoke and the metallic tang of illness. Clara lay in the master bedroom, her skin fevered and damp, her pulse weak. Edward stood beside her, rigid and silent, his expression unreadable. "She's been unwell for days," he muttered, "but I could not bear to see her suffer under another man's care." Fenwick examined her, noting the signs of exhaustion, malnutrition, and emotional strain. She murmured incoherently, clutching at a small silver locket that hung around her neck. When Fenwick asked to remove it, Edward refused. "It is her comfort," he said sharply, "a reminder of what she has lost." But as the doctor leaned closer, Clara's hand loosened, and the locket slipped free. It fell open upon the coverlet, revealing a tiny photograph, aged, water-stained, but unmistakable. It showed Edward as a younger man, holding an infant swaddled in lace. On the back, in delicate handwriting, was the date March 4th, 1877. Fenwick froze, his mind racing. He knew the rumors. the old tragedy of the drowned wife and lost child. The resemblance was undeniable. The same eyes, the same birthmark just visible beneath the infant's chin. He looked up to find Edward staring at him, his face drained of all color. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Edward said softly, "Now you see why she belongs here." Fenwick's voice trembled when he demanded an explanation, but Edward only smiled, an expression both sorrowful and defiant. He spoke of fate, of divine reunion, of how the dead return to those who love them most. Clara stirred, whispering Edward's name like a prayer, unaware of the horror unfolding around her. The doctor left her side and turned to confront him, but Edward raised a trembling hand. "You think this wicked," he said, "but you did not hold your child as she took her first breath. You did not feel that breath return to you after 20 years. Unable to reason with him, Fenwick waited until dawn, when Edward finally collapsed from exhaustion. He gathered the locket and a torn page from Edward's desk, part of a letter addressed to no one, then fled the estate to alert the magistrate. Later that day, he returned with officials, but Edward and Clara were gone. Only the journals remained, and the faint imprint of two figures upon the unmade bed, as if they had lain there hand in hand, waiting for judgment that never came. The trial of Edward Harrow was unlike any England had ever seen. By the time he was apprehended, the nation was already in the grip of morbid fascination. Newspapers labeled him the gentleman of sin, and crowds gathered outside the courthouse eager to glimpse the man who had married his own daughter. The courtroom itself, a grand hall in Norwich, was packed with spectators, clergy, journalists, and members of parliament seated beside ordinary citizens. Every seat was filled, the air heavy with the mingled scent of ink, sweat, and candle wax. When Edward was led in, he appeared eerily calm. His hair was neatly combed, his coat immaculate, his expression one of quiet resignation rather than guilt. Clara was brought in separately, frail and pale, her eyes lowered to the floor, one hand resting protectively on her stomach. The prosecution laid out the evidence with clinical precision. They produced the journals, the letters, the photograph from the locket, and testimony from Dr. Fenwick, whose discovery had exposed the crime. Witnesses described Edward's years of secrecy, the sealed nursery, the falsified records of his daughter's death, and the strange payments sent to the convent in Yorkshire. Each revelation drew gasps from the audience, yet Edward sat motionless, sometimes closing his eyes as if bored by the repetition of facts. When asked whether he acknowledged Clara as his biological daughter, he answered, "By blood, yes, but blood does not define the soul." His words rippled through the courtroom, both horrifying and mesmerizing. Clara's testimony was more difficult. She spoke softly, haltingly, describing her life at the convent, her lack of memory, her confusion upon meeting Edward. She said he treated her with tenderness, that she had felt drawn to him without knowing why. When asked when she discovered the truth, tears filled her eyes. "It was after we married," she whispered. "He told me in confession, saying God had reunited what man had separated." Her statement silenced the room. Even the judge, a stern man known for his composure, removed his spectacles and rubbed his temples. As the trial continued, public opinion split. Some saw Edward as a lunatic, unfit to stand trial. Others believed he was a calculating monster who cloaked depravity in the language of divine love. His defense argued that he suffered from delusion brought on by grief and isolation, that he truly believed Clara was his wife reborn. Edward himself, when granted the chance to speak, delivered a speech that would be reprinted in every paper across Britain. "You condemn me," he said, "because you see with eyes trained by law. But the law knows nothing of love. You call this sin. I call it reunion. The blood of the father flows in the child. So what is union but the circle completed?" His voice was clear, unwavering, almost reverent. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. The verdict, guilty of incest, fraud, and moral corruption, was met with both applause and horror. As Edward was led away, he turned once toward Clara, who sat trembling in her chair. "Do not fear," he said. "We were one before this world, and we shall be one after it." His words lingered long after the courtroom emptied, echoing through the corridors like a curse. The aftermath of the Harrow case was as haunting as the crime itself. Edward's death came quietly, just months after his sentencing. The official report described it as natural causes, though rumors persisted that he had taken his own life by swallowing crushed glass smuggled into his cell. Others whispered that he simply stopped eating, retreating into silence until his body failed. Guards claimed that on his final night, they heard him murmuring through the bars, reciting lines from scripture, pausing between verses to whisper Clara's name. When dawn broke, he was found sitting upright against the wall, eyes open as if waiting for someone who never came. Clara's fate was more uncertain. Her pregnancy had already drawn unwanted attention, and when the stillborn child was delivered in the infirmary, she refused to see it. Her mind seemed to fracture under the weight of shame and grief. Witnesses said she spent hours tracing the veins in her hands, whispering that her blood felt wrong. The courts released her to a women's asylum in the north, citing fragile mental health. She remained there for nearly a year before vanishing. Records showed that one stormy night, she walked out through the garden gates and was never seen again. Some said she drowned herself in the same river her mother had disappeared into 2 decades before. Others claimed she was seen years later in London, under another name, her face hidden by a mourning veil. The Harrow estate, seized by the Crown, stood abandoned for decades. Locals avoided the grounds, insisting that lights could still be seen moving through the upper windows, though the house had long been without electricity. Children dared each other to approach the gates at night, where the rusted lock bore a single word scratched into the metal: redeemed. In time, the estate decayed into ruin, its halls overtaken by ivy and silence. Only the portraits remained intact, their faces strangely preserved while the canvas around them crumbled. One in particular drew curiosity, a painting of Edward and a young woman seated beside him. Her features were blurred, unfinished, as though the painter himself could not decide who she was meant to be. The legal consequences of the case reached far beyond the village. Parliament revisited marriage laws, strengthening requirements for identity verification and record-keeping. The church issued new decrees regarding the sanctity of bloodlines, while newspapers debated whether isolation could drive even the most civilized minds toward moral collapse. Philosophers and theologians wrote essays dissecting Edward's beliefs, calling them a grotesque blend of theology and desire. Yet the deeper horror of the case, the quiet complicity of those who looked away, was never addressed. Neighbors had suspected something was wrong, but chose silence out of fear, respect, or morbid curiosity. The Harrow affair became a parable of human denial, a reminder that evil often grows not from darkness alone, but from those who refuse to see it. Long after the trials ended and the estate crumbled, villagers still spoke of a voice that could be heard across the fens on windless nights. A woman's voice, faint and sorrowful, repeating the same question again and again: father or husband? As the echoes of the Harrow tragedy fade into the mist, one can't help but wonder, how far does love bend before it breaks? Was Edward Harrow a madman, or merely a mirror reflecting the darkness buried within human longing? History remembers him as a monster, yet his words, twisted as they were, still linger in the air like a prayer unanswered. If stories like this one compel you to question what lies beneath the surface of so-called morality, then stay close. Subscribe to uncover more forgotten crimes, forbidden secrets, and the shadows history tried to erase. Share your thoughts in the comments. Was Edward driven by grief, delusion, or something far more terrifying? Your voice becomes part of the investigation, part of the reckoning. In every century, there are truths buried too deep for comfort, and we're here to dig them up, one story at a time. So light your lantern, step quietly into the past, and join us for the next descent into darkness.